Welcome back, listener. How are you? And I'm glad you had a good week. Welcome back to another exciting episode of Aaron's Opinion, the podcast for blind people where we talk about issues in the blindness community. Tonight, I'm joined by a very special guest, someone who likes to call herself Caspher has joined our podcast. We This is someone that I do not know in life. We met on basically a live streaming app of the sorts. It's kind of like live streaming, but just audio.
Yeah.
So that's basically how I met Caspher. Caspher, why don't you get into telling our listeners about yourself and what you want us to know? And, let's start with, how did you become blind, by the way? Were you born blind, or is this something you have dealt with later on in life?
I was born with blindness as well as being born hard of hearing.
Okay.
Yes. So I am deaf blind with some remaining hearing and residual eyesight.
Okay. Understood. And what did you tell our listeners about, your maybe early life or the things that you did growing up? Tell some stories for us.
Oh, I'm a years old, and basically I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts. I went to mainstream school, even though I lived really close to Perkins School for the Blind
Mm-hmm.
and the local training center for the blind in Newton, Massachusetts. My entire academic career was mainstream. I finally attended my first training center for the blind in 2014 and attended my second and last training center for the blind in 2015. I devoted 10 months of my life to get some comprehensive intensive training from one of the oldest organizations for the blind's training sites. And amid that training experience, I realized I began to go deaf, like even more, at a training center for the blind. By that time, I didn't identify as deaf blind because I didn't really think much about it. But as things got more complex, I realized I am not your classic blind or visually impaired person. I am deaf blind, and I took that with me as part of my experience. And after that, I started trying to address my other disability that was really hard to ignore. So I started looking into taking sign language classes, the Helen Keller way first. So I just, I grew into my identity as deaf blind, Caspher being deaf blind.
So, when you say identity, I think that's really important. There's a lot I've noticed in a lot of these various blind groups that I'm on Facebook, that there's a lot of questions about identity and about, what it truly means to be blind, and that there's there's all these different opinions out there. So what can you tell us about basically the intersection or the combination between being someone who is both blind and deaf?
The difference is, communication is different. Like when you are someone who is just, living with just blindness on any level, you have your other senses you could rely on. You've got your hearing, so you can listen for audio cues of like turning vehicles. Whereas when you are deaf blind, you don't belong in either the blind or the deaf community. because they both point fingers at each other when it comes to you experiencing both. So you're pretty much forced to create your own lane, your own lane, which is pretty much all of the tiles of your own experiences from your past leading into your future.
What is Caspher's lane?
Caspher's lane consists of, what happened in the past and what it's leading to in the future. And no one knows that experience until I tell them. Well, they don't know the story of my lane until I tell them.
So tell a story. Tell us an interesting story of your lane.
An interesting story of my lane. From early on, I was a music enthusiast. Well, I am still. I really do appreciate music. And I really appreciate art, too. Art, which is a very visual thing, and music, which is a very, extremely hearing person thing, I would say. And with both of those senses compromised, I still can enjoy it with whatever's left of both my eyesight and my hearing. So Caspher once was fascinated with Snoop Dogg one time in 1997, and her music teacher asked her to sing her favorite song in school. And guess what happened? I decided to get onto a table and started singing Snoop Dogg in front of the class early in the morning. And that included the explicit language too. And the students started once they heard it. And yeah, the teacher couldn't really get us in control. And he immediately regret asking students to sing their favorite song, because after that Snoop Dogg thing came out, everybody else started singing Snoop song.
That's okay. That's a good one. See, that's a good story. That's funny. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, I don't think that teacher likes to ask you to sing. That teacher, if still working, which I strongly doubt they're still working, but if they are, they probably have edited that part out of their lesson plan. I mean, before the days of Snoop Dogg, what were the favorite songs, or what were good songs to sing before Snoop Dogg?
Before Snoop Dogg, I was just pretty much walking around singing En Vogue, Never Gonna Get It, all the time. And I drove my classmates crazy.
I'm not entirely familiar with that one. Do you want to sing that one for us?
En Vogue, with the popular line, never gonna get it, never gonna get it, never gonna get it.
Yeah, that is already annoying. That is already immense. Yeah, that's annoying. Yeah, I can see where this would create a problem, would create some sort of an annoyance. That's a funny story. Yeah, I mean, I think. Well, of course, I mean, Caspher, you don't know me. I am a little bit more about where I'm coming from. So I'm 29 years old, and for personal reasons that have nothing to do with the podcast, I live in some sort of an undisclosable location.
Okay.
That's a whole nother story. But I mean, I was mainstream too. I went to a mainstream public school, and I mean, my experience overall, my experience was, not that great. There were a lot of challenges going through public school, and I can't tell you what's really better. It's hard to say. At one point, I would have easily said, it's better. It's better to just, make a blind child just go to a public school, but then again there's a lot of problems in the public schools, and then you can say, well, go to a school for the blind. Well, then the philosophical problem with that is that it's not how we're living in a public sense.
I
It's not,
agree.
it's not how mainstream society works. Um I have observed that people who have been through schools for the blind, um tend to have some struggles and challenges later on in life. But then again, I think at this point, I think everybody has some level of struggle or some level of challenge, no matter who you are, really. um but yeah, yes, that is all very interesting. And then, all right, so you went through public school and then you went to university. In my case, I studied international relations, by the way. Did
Nice.
you? I wish I had studied education. I wish I had studied something else. It sounds interesting, but it's painfully boring. And then amazingly boring. And what about you? Do you want to tell us more about some interesting experiences you had through
Um,
university and things like that?
sure. I studied visual arts with a minor in English, and
I think that's very ironic and very interesting for a
it
blind
is.
person to study visual. Okay, so talk about that's a really interesting answer. So can you talk to our listeners more about an interesting or perhaps a controversial conversation you had with
I
with an art teacher?
Oh gosh, the art teacher and a blind student. Um, so I mean, I had slightly better vision back then,
Hmm.
but it was never ever enough for me to even be considered able to drive.
Hmm.
So I was always, visually impaired. So the interesting experience was when my instructor asked me to draw something on a smaller structure,
Mm.
and I couldn't because I couldn't see it enough. And if I needed to see it, I needed to get very close. And because we were dealing with a lot of pointed objects, I often got yelled at a lot for having
Mm.
had
Hmm.
my face right up to the thing. And so the accommodation for that was to use a larger space for my artwork, with extra lighting and heavier lines instead of a really thin line which looked like nothing on the paper. Um, I got away with using bigger lines because I legitimately couldn't see it.
Mm.
And it kind of, it upset the instructor because it ruined the whole goal of what she wanted her students to accomplish. But because I physically couldn't see it, there was no other way around it. And I refused to let her tell me what I could and couldn't do
Right.
because she's not seeing anything through my eyes. That's Caspher's view, you know.
Hmm. Casper's View. That's what this episode is called. Casper's View. By the way, I like that. I like that. Casper's
Caspher's
View.
view.
Yes. Yes. Or or something else. Or Casper the Friendly Teacher.
Oh
But
yeah, it can go either way.
yeah, that's a really good Casper the Friendly Teacher. Um, but yeah, I mean that interests me. What I should have studied is education, because that's my job. When I'm not podcasting, I'm a teacher. I teach English as a second language online, and
Awesome.
and that's really amazing for me. That's a really cool opportunity. Um, so I wish that I had studied education. Probably the truth is, if I had studied education, I wouldn't be working in education. Is probably the truth of that. You know, you, you if but who knows, really, who knows. So all right, so can you talk more about some other experiences at this university studying art and things like that?
I got banned from going into the black room for photography because on the first day there was a little mishap that happened. So the room was so dark that the entrance to that black room for photography literally looked like a black door. And me being me,